The royal corridors whispered of emeralds and sapphires, but no one ever questioned the fate of the Crown Rubies until Princess Anne's stunning revelation shattered decades of silence. In a moment that froze every royal heart, Anne dropped a bombshell. Queen Elizabeth had left the entire ruby collection to young Princess Charlotte, bypassing Camilla, Catherine, and even Charles. But why? And what does it mean for the monarchy's future? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It was an otherwise controlled gathering within the private halls of Windsor, meant only for senior royals and their most trusted aides, when Princess Anne, composed yet visibly burdened, stepped forward and unfolded a single-aged parchment. The silence that followed her words was not the silence of awe, it was the silence of shock, disbelief, and, for some, betrayal. The ruby collection, long thought to be held in trust for the reigning monarch's spouse, had been entirely and exclusively bequeathed to Princess Charlotte, the youngest female in the direct line of succession. Camilla's face reportedly paled, her lips parting in stunned silence. Not even Charles had seen this coming, and it showed. It was as if the late queen had drawn a bloodline in crimson stone, one that marked where her loyalty truly lay in her final days. The Crown Rubies, while never as publicly flaunted as the emeralds worn at state banquets or the sapphires associated with Diana's memory, held a power of their own. Passed through queens, empresses, and wartime protectors, these stones weren't simply jewelry, they were relics of female sovereignty. And yet Queen Elizabeth had never formally addressed them in public. Their location was a mystery, their fate was an enigma, and now the answer was devastatingly clear. She had preserved them for one heir only, and that heir was Charlotte. What drove such a decision? Many in the room speculated whether the Queen feared internal palace politics. Perhaps she believed that Catherine might one day be forced to surrender them to the consort hierarchy, or worse, that Camilla might assert claim over them through Charles's reign. Camilla's reaction betrayed more than surprise. It revealed a crack in the unity she had tried for years to build with Elizabeth's lineage. Her silence wasn't gracious, it was combustible. Sources claim she later demanded answers behind closed doors, insisting there had to be a mistake, that Charlotte's age made such a gesture implausible. But the Queen's will, signed and sealed, left no ambiguity. Charlotte's name was written in Elizabeth's own hand, underlined twice. And Anne, bound by years of silence, had now honoured a private promise by making it public. Her voice didn't tremble, it thundered with conviction. She spoke not just as a sister, but as a sentinel of the Queen's deepest wishes. Whispers grew louder that Elizabeth had been orchestrating something far greater in her final years. Was the ruby bequest a symbolic anointing of Charlotte as a future leader in her own right? Had the Queen sensed a rising tide of internal discord and chosen to plant her legacy in the next generation, not in sons or daughters-in-law, but in a granddaughter untouched by scandal? The rubies, rich in their violent hue, had once been worn in battle and peace. They represented a monarchy that fought, endured, and protected. By giving them to Charlotte, Elizabeth had passed down more than beauty, she had passed down resilience, command, and perhaps rebellion. The ripple effects were immediate. Tensions spiked between branches of the family, especially among those who saw themselves as rightful heirs to such artifacts. There was no press release, no official portrait, just a quiet storm inside palace walls. What started as a simple reading of a will had evolved into a tectonic shift in royal favour. The Queen's rubies now represented not just inheritance, but allegiance. And at the centre of it all, unaware and innocent, stood a young girl who had unknowingly inherited the weight of an empire's blood-red history. But what Charlotte never knew, and what Anne had waited years to reveal, was only the beginning of a far deeper royal betrayal rooted in Elizabeth's final months. For years Anne carried a weight that nearly broke her. Bound by her mother's dying wish, she remained silent until the pressure of palace politics, power shifts, and Catherine's quiet rise forced her hand. The moment Anne decided to speak, she knew everything would change, and she was right. But what forced her silence for so long? Final months of Queen Elizabeth's life were marked not only by declining health, but by a series of intensely private conversations held behind firmly closed doors. One such exchange, etched into Anne's memory like a scar, occurred 2 weeks before the Queen's last public appearance. In a hushed moment that RC'd through the formality of centuries-old tradition, the monarch took Anne's hand and entrusted her with a secret that could shake the throne. The rubies, her most sacred possession, were to bypass every senior royal and land in the hands of her great-granddaughter Charlotte. No explanation, no debate, only a directive cloaked in absolute trust. But with that instruction came a condition that haunted Anne, not a word, not until the time is right. And so Anne vowed to guard the truth, until silence became more dangerous than revelation. What stirred Anne from that vow wasn't betrayal. It was fear. The monarchy was shifting. Catherine, once seen as a quiet consort in training, was becoming something more. Her presence was now command, her silence strategic, her movements calculated. She had taken no crown, yet her influence was unmistakable. And as Catherine rose, Anne began to feel a creeping anxiety that the Queen's vision might never be fulfilled if the right people weren't informed. Behind every royal wave and every state appearance, Anne watched the old order bending, breaking. And yet, the sealed truth remained locked in a drawer behind her desk. A drawer she visited more times than she could count, never to open, always to remember. Anne's heart was torn between the ghost of her mother's voice and the pounding reality of the crown's fragility. She had no ill will toward Catherine. In truth, she admired her. But admiration alone could not override obligation. Elizabeth had not chosen Catherine, she had chosen Charlotte, and Anne began to wonder if the Queen feared something she herself had only dared to whisper in private that Camilla, if left unchecked, would use to rubies not as a symbol of legacy, but as currency for image, optics, and reinvention. Elizabeth didn't want her rubies worn. She wanted them protected, preserved, shielded until the one who was born to lead Charlotte was ready to claim them with purpose, not vanity. That suspicion grew into certainty the day Anne found the envelope. Hidden inside a velvet case, marked with the Queen's crest and sealed in scarlet wax, it bore only 3 chilling words: Charlotte, only, confidential. Anne never opened it. She never had to. The moment she held it, she understood its weight. It wasn't just a letter. It was a map to a future that had been written in secret and buried beneath layers of royal facade. But still, Anne said nothing until the final trigger came from her own brother. It was a private conversation with Charles, unrecorded and unconfirmed, but whispered by those closest to the walls that hold every royal secret. In it, Charles allegedly hinted at a reallocation of symbolic assets, a subtle nod that the rubies might soon be reassigned for greater visibility. That phrase, greater visibility, was all Anne needed to hear. In that moment, silence became betrayal. She knew the Queen's will could not be reinterpreted, not reshuffled for pageantry or politics. That night, Anne opened the drawer, took out the will, and made her decision. The monarchy might not have been ready for the truth, but the time had come to deliver it anyway. As Anne's voice broke through decades of secrecy, the Queen's hidden intentions began to unravel, pointing not only to Charlotte, but to a future the late monarch had meticulously designed. She's only a child in the public's eyes, but behind CE walls, Charlotte has already been positioned as more than a royal daughter. She is the Queen's quiet legacy. When Elizabeth made the ruby decision, she wasn't just gifting jewelry, she was signaling her belief in a future monarch, and the signs were there all along, hidden in plain sight, while the world remained fixated on traditional succession and the polished appearances of senior royals. Queen Elizabeth was playing a much deeper game, one grounded in bloodline instinct, subtle gestures, and legacy management few would ever understand. It wasn't until the rubies were mentioned in her final will that royal insiders began looking backward and connecting the pieces the Queen had scattered with careful intention. There had been visits, private, unannounced, undocumented. Elizabeth would often request time alone with Charlotte. These weren't grandmotherly playdates. These were purposeful moments, concealed in routine, where wisdom flowed quietly from one monarch to a child who had yet to grasp the full weight of what she would carry. The Queen never spoke of these encounters publicly, but whispers inside Balmoral and Sandringham speak of readings, intimate chats, and long walks, in which the Queen recited passages of royal duty and loss. There were no grand declarations, only symbols. One moment in particular, witnessed by a trusted staff member, stood out. Elizabeth handed Charlotte her personal writing quill, one she'd used since the early years of her reign. It was a small item, but in the royal world, heirlooms are language. That same week, Charlotte was seen draped in a tartan shawl previously reserved for the Queen herself, a subtle but unmistakable passing of heritage. These weren't coincidences. These were deliberate, loaded actions, and those who paid attention understood something rare was unfolding. The decision to bypass Prince George for this legacy left many rattled, but not Anne. She knew. Elizabeth hadn't chosen Charlotte because of birth order. She'd chosen her because of presence. Even as a child, Charlotte carried herself with a balance of grace and strength that echoed a young Elizabeth. Where George was poised for kingship, Charlotte was being quietly prepared for guardianship of legacy, of artifacts, of stories not written in history books. The Queen's final letter, never released to the public but confirmed by 2 independent sources, contained just 7 words: "Guard this with your life, it matters." That letter accompanied the rubies, wrapped not in silk or velvet, but in parchment and principle. Staff behaviour also began to shift during the Queen's final year. Subtle changes, noticed only by those within the inner circle. Charlotte was no longer addressed with playful familiarity, but with a certain deference. Protocol meetings began to include documents where her name appeared earlier than expected. Rooms were prepared before her arrival. Her presence was anticipated, not as a child, but as something more. The staff knew something was changing, even if they couldn't name it. They were preparing for a future the Queen had already written. But while Charlotte remained blissfully unaware of her looming legacy, others within the royal circle were already mobilizing to embrace it, to challenge it, or to destroy it. Camilla believed she had secured her place, crowned, embraced, and adorned. But the rubies represented so. Methinks she could never truly possess Elizabeth's trust. Behind closed doors, Camilla launched a furious, calculated campaign to reclaim what she believed was hers. And what she uncovered in her search for answers would shake even Charles. The moment Anne's voice confirmed that the Queen had bypassed every senior royal to leave the Crown Ruby collection to Princess Charlotte, something within Camilla fractured. Those in the room saw it, the tight smile faltered, her hand clenched the chair a second too long, and her eyes locked with Charles's in a silent plea for explanation. But none came, not even from the king himself. For Camilla, it wasn't just a loss of jewels, it was a public dismissal of her legitimacy. She had worn the crown, she had stood beside the monarch, yet she had been left in the dark, and in that darkness, fury bloomed. That same night she retreated from the public eye, but privately she erupted. Shouts were reportedly heard behind palace doors. The words, "How dare she?" rang through the corridors not with sadness, but with rage. What followed was a confrontation only a royal marriage could survive. Camilla demanded answers from Charles, cornering him not as a queen, but as a woman betrayed. "Did you know about this?" she asked him, her voice cracked with disbelief. Charles, stunned by the revelation himself, could offer little more than denial. But denial wasn't enough. Camilla wanted answers, and when she couldn't get them from her husband, she turned to the one place the truth might still live, the Queen's private diaries. It was a bold move, but one she believed justified. Yet Anne, ever the gatekeeper of her mother's final wishes, swiftly intervened. Access denied. The pages remained sealed, and Camilla's fury only grew more volatile. It didn't take long for whispers to spread. A leak anonymously sourced but unmistakably linked suggested Camilla was exploring legal avenues to challenge the ruby bequest. Not to claim the rubies for herself, but to invalidate the exclusive handover to Charlotte. Behind the scenes, she aligned herself with a former royal aide, one notorious for manipulating public perception, one who had once advised against Charles's marriage to her in the first place. Now their alliance raised eyebrows across the palace. Together they plotted a narrative that painted the ruby handover as a breach of royal inheritance protocols, something that could potentially unravel trust in the late Queen's final decisions. The campaign was subtle but deadly in intent. Rumours were planted, articles drafted. Behind the veil of civility, Camilla issued quiet warnings that if Charlotte ever wore the rubies at a state event, there would be consequences. Threats disguised as tradition, suggestions masked as protocol. The message was clear: Charlotte may have the rubies in title, but she would never wear them under Camilla's reign without a fight. It was a battle Camilla was prepared to wage in silence, through influence, through legacy, through fear. But even Camilla's fury couldn't prepare the palace for what came next, a vault opening ordered by William that would expose truths no one expected. For years, the late Queen's private vault beneath Windsor was sealed by royal decree. But with tensions boiling, Prince William exercised an ancient power to open it. Inside, he didn't just find jewels. He found documents, recordings, and one handwritten letter addressed to Charlotte, and one to him. What they revealed would threaten the unity of the House of Windsor itself. It wasn't a decision William took lightly. The vault had remained untouched since the Queen's passing, guarded not just by physical locks, but by layers of tradition, loyalty, and royal protocol. Yet the storm brewing around the ruby inheritance, the whispers, the threats, the divisions had escalated beyond what even the stoic prince could ignore. Camilla's legal murmurs, Charles's conflicted silence, the media's frenzy. It was no longer about jewels, it was about the Queen's authority being questioned from beyond the grave. William, burdened by duty and a growing instinct to shield both his daughter and the monarchy, made the call. Accompanied only by Princess Anne and Catherine, he descended into the vault, knowing that what he uncovered might not only answer questions, it might set a new course entirely. The air in the chamber was heavy with secrecy, but it was Anne's hand that guided them to the precise drawer, as if she had known all along it would come to this. The Queen's crest was etched into the lacquered surface, and within it sat the unmistakable red envelope, sealed, thick, and marked with a single name in the Queen's elegant handwriting, Charlotte. Beneath it, a second letter, addressed simply to William. He opened his first, and what he read broke through every ounce of composure he carried. "She will need you to protect her," it read, "not just from the world, but from those within." It wasn't a warning, it was a command, a passing of the torch. Elizabeth had seen the battle coming, and she had chosen her general. Beneath the letters was something even more damning, a hidden inventory log, previously excluded from all official palace records. In it, every item removed from public view was catalogued, and at the top of the list, dated 11 months before the Queen's passing, were the Crown Rubies. Removed, marked private, and relocated under Elizabeth's direct orders. It proved what Anne had long suspected, but never dared to voice: this wasn't a last-minute decision. It had been orchestrated in silence, with meticulous care. And, just beside the log, a signed addendum. 6 words written in ink that had barely faded, not to be contested. Final sovereign act, what William now held in his hands, was more than a justification for Charlotte's inheritance. It was a written rebuke to any attempt at reversal. The Queen's authority, preserved in paper and ink, now rested on his shoulders. He said nothing in that moment, neither did Anne. But Catherine, her eyes locked on the letter, understood its gravity. This wasn't just a matter of legacy. This was a shield, a royal decree designed to outlast politics, pride, and personal agendas. As William and Anne emerged from the vault, the gravity of what they held began to ripple across the monarchy, and Catherine knew this changed everything. While others erupted in chaos, Catherine remained calm. But behind her poised smile was a mind calculating every outcome. She had always known Charlotte was different, and now she had the Queen's blessing to protect her. With Anne's help, Catherine set in motion a plan not even Charles saw coming. Catherine had learned long ago that power in the royal family wasn't declared, it was wielded quietly, in spurs and glances, in unseen strategies woven beneath the glitter of tradition. As the storm around the ruby inheritance roared through the palace, Catherine did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every move she made was deliberate, wrapped in silence, and aimed at one goal: securing Charlotte's future. While Camilla made noise, Catherine made arrangements. She began subtly elevating Charlotte's public image, placing her at the forefront of key events, ensuring the press had no choice but to see her not merely as a child, but as a future force. Carefully selected charities, thoughtfully chosen appearances, she understood the game and she played it with precision. But her true work happened behind closed doors. She met frequently with Princess Anne not as equals, but as guardians of a legacy only they truly understood. Together, they orchestrated the protection of the ruby collection, moving it to a location unknown even to senior courtiers. They ensured nothing could be accessed, reassigned, or repurposed without Charlotte's eventual consent. But Catherine didn't stop there. She began quietly drafting a future transition plan, a framework that would allow Charlotte to one day assume a ceremonial role not defined by traditional customs, but one born of symbolic authority. In a monarchy shaped by men, she envisioned a space where a girl armed not with a crown, but with her great-grandmother's trust could change everything. To justify this seismic shift, Catherine enlisted a team of loyal historians and royal scholars, individuals who understood the weight of artifacts and the narrative power they held. Together, they crafted a reinterpretation of the Crown Ruby collection, reframing it not as ornamental inheritance, but as sovereign markers passed not to the Queen's consort, but to her chosen successor. A new mythos began to take shape, one rooted in blood, will, and intention. And in that mythos, Charlotte wasn't just a child of Cambridge. She was the keeper of Elizabeth's final fire. When Camilla attempted to regain control of the narrative, Catherine responded not through lawyers or statements, but in private, direct conversation. It was said that she stood before Camilla, unwavering, and delivered a single sentence that cut through every layer of tension. The Queen chose her. No argument followed. No reply was needed. The war was already lost, and Camilla knew it, but Catherine wasn't done. She quietly began discussions about instituting a new royal protocol, one that would define Charlotte as the first female legacy heir. Not a reigning queen-in-waiting, but a symbolic successor to the Queen's personal principles, virtues, and vision. A ceremonial role with no legal weight, yet one with immeasurable public influence. It was subtle, brilliant, and unstoppable. But as Catherine tightened her grip on the narrative, an unexpected player entered the arena, Prince Harry, with a message that threatened to derail everything. Out of exile and into the storm, Harry returned not with reconciliation but with accusations. According to palace insiders, Meghan had warned of hidden favoritism years before. Now, with Charlotte at the centre of it all, Harry sought to expose what he called Elizabeth's hidden monarchy, and it left the family reeling. Harry's re-entry into the royal arena wasn't marked by diplomacy, it was charged with disruption. He arrived unannounced in the midst of the Ruby firestorm, not for a quiet visit, but to confront what he believed was the Crown's deepest betrayal. The moment he learned that Queen Elizabeth had left the legendary rubies solely to Charlotte, something inside him shifted, not because of envy, but because it confirmed a suspicion he and Meghan had carried for years, that a parallel line of power had been quietly drawn, one that dismissed tradition in favour of secret intention. To Harry, the monarchy was no longer just a family. It was an institution that manipulated legacy at will, and he was ready to tear away the curtain shielding it. Behind the scenes, a private recording surfaced. A conversation between Harry and a long-time palace advisor had been captured and leaked. In it, Harry spoke with raw disbelief, accusing the Queen of bypassing lineage logic, the principle that power should follow order, not preference. His words were clipped but cutting. "It's not just about Charlotte," he said. "It's about the system, about who gets chosen behind closed doors." The leak exploded across global media within hours. And almost immediately, Meghan's past remarks from interviews began resurfacing cryptic statements about internal favoritism, patterns of affection, and a hierarchy of attention that extended far beyond the cameras. The brothers collided behind those same palace walls where they were once inseparable. William, already holding the Queen's final letters and the sealed inventory log, stood firm in his defence of Charlotte's inheritance. But Rye refused to accept that this was simply the Queen's last wish. He saw it as a rewriting of the royal playbook, a legacy of exclusion wrapped in sentimental symbolism. Their clash wasn't public, but it was volcanic. Words were exchanged that would never be repeated. What had once been a rift between two men was now a fissure threatening to swallow the entire House of Windsor. What made it worse was the external consequence. With the world watching Charlotte as the child chosen to carry the Queen's most personal legacy, security alerts rose to a new level. Threats emerged not from outside forces, but from online campaigns ignited by the controversy. For the first time, serious conversations were had about whether Charlotte should be temporarily pulled from public engagements. What was meant to be a quiet inheritance had become a firestorm, and at its centre stood a young girl unaware of the storm brewing in her name. And then came the moment that broke through the media noise. Harry, asked privately by a close confidant why he seemed so intent on challenging Charlotte's role, reportedly answered with a trembling voice, "Because I know what it's like to grow up under their silence. She was never meant to be just a spare, was she?" In that haunting sentence, the pain of generations collided with the politics of legacy. The rubies weren't just stones anymore. They were a symbol of a truth buried too long. With fractures deepening and allegiances shifting, it was only a matter of time before Charles was forced to confront the inheritance and the daughter he never expected to rise. He had always assumed the monarchy's path would flow through him, then William, then George. But as he held the Queen's sealed ruby decree in his hands, Charles faced a truth he couldn't ignore. His mother had chosen Charlotte, and the monarchy might never be the same again. Alone in the stillness of his private quarters, King Charles stared at the document he never expected to read. The handwriting, unmistakably Elizabeth's, carried the finality of a sovereign's will and the weight of a mother's conviction. There were no justifications, no annotations, just a name, Charlotte, and a quiet but thunderous act of transfer. The rubies were hers, the symbolism, undeniable. And for the first time in his reign, Charles felt the chill of being bypassed not by chance, but by choice. It wasn't about stones, it was about trust, about legacy, about what the Queen had seen in a child that the world had only begun to recognize. Unable to bury the questions erupting inside him, Charles sought the one person who might hold the missing pieces, his sister. In a rare private exchange, he asked Anne a question that hung between them like a sword. Did she ever tell you why? Anne, composed yet unguarded, gave no lecture, no defense. Only a pause and then a quiet reply. She didn't need to. That silence said everything. Elizabeth had not made a spontaneous decision in her final days. She had been building a new line of influence beneath the throne's visible structure, one rooted not in rank, but in readiness. Charles finally saw it. The secret meetings, the hidden mentorship, the invisible hand shaping Charlotte's path before anyone else had noticed. That realization shattered something in him, then rebuilt something else. The father, the monarch, and the son within him collided in a single moment of clarity. He had spent his life preparing to uphold a system. But his mother had spent her final years quietly reinventing it. In a gesture few witnessed, Charles visited Charlotte without cameras, advisors, or protocol. In his hand, a small velvet pouch, not the rubies, but something older. A locket that had belonged to Elizabeth when she was Charlotte's age. He knelt not to bestow power, but to acknowledge it. No words were exchanged, only a look. But those present later described it as the moment a king bent not to a crown, but to a future beyond his own. In the weeks that followed, the palace calendar began to shift. Charlotte's name appeared in briefing schedules previously reserved for senior royals. Her presence at public events became more frequent, more prominent. Advisors noticed it, commentators speculated on it, but none could deny it. A new light had been lit in the royal order. And then the king made his most unexpected move yet. In a carefully worded address, standing before both Parliament and people, he spoke with gravity. Legacy, he said, is not always chosen by age, but by vision. No names were spoken, but no one misunderstood. But before the dust could settle, one final twist emerged: Charlotte's own handwritten response to her great-grandmother's letter, and it would silence the world. She's just a girl. But when Charlotte penned her response to the Queen's final letter, it stunned the monarchy and left even the most stoic royals in tears. Her words weren't of power or inheritance, they were of duty, humility, and love. And in that moment, the crown rubies meant more than jewels. They became a symbol of a new era. When Charlotte was finally told what had been left to her, not just the rubies, but the Queen's unwavering trust, she didn't smile, she didn't boast, she didn't ask why. Instead, she quietly held the letter in her lap and whispered to Catherine, "Can I write back, even if she's in heaven?" That single question shattered the last barrier between child and legacy. Catherine nodded, and the room stilled as a new letter was born, one not from a royal to a monarch, but from a granddaughter to a great-grandmother. The words she wrote would never be forgotten. In her own hand, Charlotte thanked the Queen not for the jewels, but for believing in her heart. She promised to wear the rubies only when they meant something, to stand for kindness, for strength, and for those who couldn't stand at all. She ended with a line that would soon be quoted around the globe. "I'll be brave for you, even if I'm small." When William read the letter, he didn't speak. He simply handed it to Anne, who pressed her hand to her chest and blinked back tears she hadn't shed in years. Catherine wept quietly as she pulled Charlotte close, whispering that her great-grandmother would be proud beyond measure. The letter wasn't leaked, but its essence couldn't be contained. Word spread through the palace, then beyond the gates, until it reached the world. In a matter of days, public sentiment transformed. The child once known only as the spare to the heir became something greater, an emblem of grace, an echo of Elizabeth's strength. Social media crowned her with a new title, the people's future queen. Journalists scrambled to capture the wave of adoration, but no headline could capture the feeling that swept across the nation. For the first time in years, the monarchy felt alive with promise, with emotion, with meaning, not because of politics or protocol, but because of a child's quiet promise to honor something bigger than herself. The crown rubies, once locked away in secrecy, now carried the weight of a new era, not one born of tradition, but of transformation. And Charlotte, still so young, had become the symbol of everything the Queen had hoped for: courage in silence, power in humility, and royalty in its purest form. As the ruby light shines on Charlotte's young shoulders, the world watches a legacy reawaken, not just of crowns and bloodlines, but of purpose. And one question echoes louder than ever. Was this the Queen's plan all along? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.